Hello, and welcome to our first revision PowerPoint on Paper 2, Superpower Relations in the Cold War between 1941 and 1991. Currently, we're going to be looking at the origins of the Cold War, which will span from 1941 to 1958. Today's episode will be part 1 on the early tension between the East and the West. The key content that we'll be studying today will be look at the Grand Alliance, the outcomes of the three conferences at TEHERAN, Yalta and Potsdam. We'll be looking at the ideological differences between the superpowers and the attitudes of the big three of Stalin, Truman and Churchill. We'll be looking at the development of the atomic bomb, the 2 telegrams sent to ambassadors, and the creation of Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. The first aspect of the course is to look at the Grand Alliance, which was the Allied forces of Britain, the USA and the Soviet Union who were fighting against a common enemy of Nazi Germany in World War II from 1941. In terms of the context, you have to remember that Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland in September 1939. At this point, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were actually allies due to the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1938. In 1941, through Operation Barbarossa, Germany invaded the Soviet Union and they therefore allied themselves with Britain. The USA, as they normally do, entered the war formally in December 1941 after being attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. In terms of what this links to, the Grand Alliance would link to the ideological differences, which we'll look at later in this episode, because the members of the Grand Alliance had vastly different and conflicting ideas on governing and the economy. The first meeting of the Grand Alliance happened at Tehran Conference in 1943. In terms of its outcomes, the Big Three decided to open up a second front in France by May 1944. This was to do with the USA and Britain. Up until this point, the Nazi Germany had controlled France from 1940 and no second front had been opened up since. The Soviet Union had decided to join the war, or agreed to join the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. And the impact on international relations was that it showed that the two opposing sides, despite their ideological differences, were working together against common enemies, and that Stalin was pleased at the outcome as they were the only army fighting against Germany, mainland Europe at this time, and the second front would take off the pressure from their army. In terms of what this links to, this will link to the further conferences at the Yalta Conference because the superpowers had agreed to cooperate further as the war went on. At Yalta in February 1945, the Big Three agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. At this point, Germany was being retreated back through Poland and into mainland Germany, despite having controlled all of France and most of the Soviet Union up until this point. In addition to Germany being divided into 4 zones of occupation, Berlin, which was Germany's capital, was also to be divided. The Big Three agreed to put Nazi war criminals on trial at Nuremberg after the war, and all countries freed from Nazi control would be able to hold free democratic elections. Eastern Europe, however, was to be under the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. Stalin reinforced his commitment to declaring war on Japan after Germany was defeated, as this was still going on in the Pacific. And the last thing was the setting up of the United Nations organization in order to prevent further conflict. In terms of its impact, it impacted on the development of the Cold War because Germany was a continuing source of tension over the course of the Cold War due to such incidences as the Berlin blockade and the Berlin Wall. Germany was seen as a battleground for conflict as the two opposing ideologies met there, as it was in the middle of Europe where capitalist West and communist East combined. It foreshadowed the crumbling of the Grand Alliance as disagreements started to emerge over what free elections meant to both sides, with the capitalists believing that it meant free, fair and frequent with a choice of parties, whereas the communists believe in a one-party state system. It impacted also on the relationship between the superpowers, because it foreshadowed the crumbling of the Grand Alliance as disagreements started to emerge over what free elections meant. as well as the fact that Stalin did not get what he wanted in terms of economic assistance for the Soviet Union, despite the damage that was caused to them by Nazi Germany during the 1941 to 45 period. In addition, Truman saw the control of Eastern Europe by the USSR as expansionist, whereas Stalin wanted it to create a buffer zone to protect the USSR. In terms of what this links to the Third Conference of Potsdam, as further outcomes were made there that contradicted those made at Yalta, and of course ideological differences because of the views on democratic elections differing between the superpowers. The Potsdam Conference happened after the defeat of Germany in July and August 1945. The key outcomes from that particular conference was that there was no sign of Stalin allowing free elections in Eastern Europe, and that a communist government had already been imposed on Poland. The borders of Berlin and Germany zones were, however, agreed, and the USSR were allowed to take reparations from their own zone, and also 10% from Western zones. The Potsdam Conference did, however, have quite a significant impact, certainly on the future of Europe. This was mainly because it allowed Eastern Europe to be effectively controlled by the Soviet Union. It also split Europe into two camps based on ideology, with the capitalist West and communist East. It also impacted on the relationships between the superpowers, because there was a high level of distrust and disagreement between the superpowers on the outcomes, in particular the reparations, the elections, and the borders of countries such as Poland. There was also a change in leadership in the USA. Roosevelt died in April 1945 and was replaced by his Vice President Truman. And this meant that because of Truman's attitudes towards the USSR, there was a harder line taken against them. In terms of what this links to, this conference links to the arms race, because in between the conferences, the USA successfully tested the atomic bomb, but they did not tell and inform Stalin of this development. This therefore led to an arms race between the superpowers where greater weapons were provided. This also led to the two telegrams, which we'll look at later in this episode, because the issues of distrust at Potsdam led to telegrams second-guessing the actions between the superpowers, and we're also starting to see the emergence of satellite states in Eastern Europe, with Poland becoming one of the first to become a satellite state to the Soviet Union. We've talked a lot about the ideological difference, or there being ideological differences between the superpowers. So we need to understand the idea of the differences between capitalism and communism. So capitalism is pillared in the belief of competition. It also has a strong belief in the idea of individual freedoms, as well as a free, fair, and frequent elections. As well as this, they also believe in the idea of a free press, the lack of censorship, and also civil liberties with individuals. Communism, on the other hand, believes in the idea of a state-controlled economy. That therefore means that the economy is controlled by the government and there's no competition between individuals. It does believe in the idea of one-party state, and therefore there is unlikely to be elections because there is only one political party to choose. There's a lack of civil liberties and a free press, with high levels of censorship in order to control the population. Obviously, this links to all three conferences that we've looked at in this episode. There are tensions between the superpowers because of these differences, as well as the distrust because of intervention by the West in the Russian Civil War in 1918 to 1921, and this therefore fueled the fear and paranoia of Stalin. We now need to look at the attitudes of the big three at these conferences, and we'll start with Stalin. He had a high level of distrust of capitalist countries, being a communist, and also with regards to the Russian Civil War and the Western involvement. Due to the number of times that Russia had been invaded by Western countries, he wanted to protect Russia by creating a buffer zone between the capitalist West and the Soviet Union, thereby using satellite states to create said buffer zone. He was also quite annoyed by the delay of the West to open a second front. He believed that the West were delaying the opening of the second front in order to severely weaken the Soviets, so that they would be weakened after the war ended with Germany. President Truman was a staunch anti-communist. He was not like Roosevelt, who wanted to work with Russia to some degree. He wanted to prevent Truman wanted to prevent the spread of communism within Europe, and he was convinced that Stalin wanted to take control of the entirety of Europe rather than what was given to him in the free conferences. And he was determined and stood on an election pledge to stand up to the Soviet Union leader. Churchill was only at the first two conferences after being replaced by Attlee in a general election in 1945, but that did not dampen his belief that the Soviet Union were pretty much like the Gestapo and the Nazis. He even said as much in his 1945 manifesto and campaign speeches. He didn't trust Stalin's actions and was very much aligned with Truman in terms of wondering whether this would lead to a Soviet takeover of Europe. In 1939, Britain had gone into the war with Germany to protect the independence of Poland, and what Churchill saw afterwards was effectively Stalin taking control of Poland and not making it independent. Therefore, after the Soviets liberated Poland from Nazi control, their army effectively stayed there and they created a puppet government. With regards to the development of the atomic bomb, the USA developed the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project, through a German scientist called Robert Oppenheimer. They successfully tested it in the Mojave Desert in 1945, in between the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences. As mentioned before, the test and the development was not shared with Stalin. However, espionage meant that Stalin was made aware of the test itself, and the atomic bomb was used in battle to end World War II, with two bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two Japanese cities, to force the Japanese to surrender in August 1945. The development of the atomic bomb is incredibly important for the Cold War because it led to a heightened level of distrust. Despite being wartime allies, there was a fear with the Soviet Union that the weapon would be used against them. There is a line of historical thought that believes that the second atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was not necessarily needed to be dropped before the Japanese surrendered, and that this was seen as a show of strength to the Soviet Union by the USA to say, this is what we have. The second reason why it's important is that the USA had a monopoly on the atomic bomb for 4 years. The Soviet Union did not develop theirs until 1949. And the third reason is it therefore starts an arms race between the superpowers in order to obtain more powerful weaponry, to the extent to which by the late 50s and early 1960s, the Soviets had developed the Tsar bomber, which would have effectively erased all life within a particular country based on its power. In terms of what it links to, this obviously links to the arms race because there's a further development of weapons of mass destruction, and it also links back to the Potsdam Conference because of the distrust between the USA and the USSR. After the war ended and after the conferences, there were 2 telegrams that were sent between the USA and the USSR by their ambassadors. The long telegram was sent by someone called George Kennan, who was the US ambassador in Moscow. Kennan described the Soviet Union as being aggressive within this telegram and recommended firm action against Soviet expansion. The long telegram influenced Truman's policy of containment, which we'll look at in the next episode. Novikov was the Soviet Union ambassador based in Washington. He reported back to Moscow that there was a belief that the USA wanted to dominate the world, and that there was a concern about the spread of the US Army that was abroad at the end of the war during peacetime. In terms of what this links to the policy of containment regarding the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which we'll notice in the next episode. The last thing to look at today is the satellite states in Eastern Europe. In terms of what was happening with regards to the context, coalition governments were set up by the Soviets after the Red Army had liberated these countries during World War II. It started with the communists sharing power with other political parties. Communists would tend to end up taking over the civil service, media and security, and then they would end up with arresting opposition party leaders. After that, they would then rig elections that were held in those countries to show that there was a massive support for a communist takeover. In terms of what happened in each country, you will see through this list that rigged elections tend to appear quite often. In Poland, there was rigged elections in 1947, Romania in 1946, where they then abolished the monarchy within Romania. Hungary, due to an economic crisis, there was elections held there. After the communists won, they banned all other political parties. There were rigged elections in Bulgaria in 1945. And in Czechoslovakia, there was a seizure of control in 1948 by force, and then a rigged election afterwards. In terms of what this links to, it links to the Iron Curtain speech, which Churchill spoke about at an American university in 1947, where he saw the split in Europe between communism and capitalism as set in stone. This also links back to the telegrams by Kennan, certainly by the Kennan telegram, as he had already predicted the expansion of the Soviet Union in Europe, and therefore that links into why the USA followed a policy of containment.